Okay, this is a presentation about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which happened on August 2nd through 4th of 1964. Now, if you were a part of the Class Connect about the 3.01 lesson, you heard me talk about this incident and how it led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was kind of the way that Congress went around actually declaring war, but still gave President Johnson all the tools he needed to wage war. And then you might remember that I mentioned that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a big conspiracy theory because it comes to find out what most people thought happened didn't actually happen. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so here's President Johnson, and he gives a midnight address announcing that he announces that the United States was going to go on a bombing raid after the second Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964. So some of the background. This guy here with the slicked back hair, that is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and he reported that the new South Vietnamese government was weak and that the Viet Cong controlled about 40% of the countryside, and that he feared that South Vietnam would fall to the communists without an increase in U.S. aid. So McNamara wants Johnson to send more troops to Vietnam. Also, some more background. The USS Maddox, which is a patrol ship, was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin here. Off the coast of North Vietnam on August 2nd of 1964. And then number 3, a North Vietnamese vessel attacks the Maddox in international waters. Or so we think. So, who are the key players? Of course, President Johnson, Robert McNamara, we've mentioned, Secretary of Defense. So on Monday of August 3rd at 10:30 a.m., Johnson and McNamara discuss on the phone this attack on the USS Maddox that happened the previous day. The two also discuss possible responses to the attack and how it should be handled militarily and politically. So they've been told that the USS Maddox has been attacked, and they're discussing what the next step should be. 1:21 p.m. McNamara calls Johnson again to discuss military preparations for what may occur next, and Johnson voices his concerns about jumping the gun and starting a war too soon. Tuesday, August 4th at 10:53 a.m., the next morning, Secretary of Defense McNamara calls Johnson again to inform him that the North Vietnamese have apparently sent ships and aircraft towards the U.S. ships. This could mean that the North Vietnamese plan to attack the Maddox again. At 11 a.m. that morning, McNamara calls Johnson to inform him that a second attack on the Maddox has, quote unquote, apparently occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin. The tension is clear as the two realize that this will be a major turning point requiring a strong American response. There are some of the patrol boats, terrible picture quality there. So the 3 attacking North Vietnamese torpedo boats is seen from the Maddox. That's this picture here. The U.S. destroyer damaged 2 of the boats and sank the 3rd. And retaliation by the Americans was limited to attacking those boats that day. The Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy, were then deliberately positioned to draw a second attack. "5:09 p.m. on Tuesday, August 4th, McNamara calls Johnson to discuss the breaking of the story in the press. So this story has been found out about by the press, and now Johnson or McNamara are going to have to give some type of a statement to the press to let them know what's going on. So McNamara reported to Johnson that an American destroyer in the region was under torpedo attack by the North Vietnamese. Their brief conversation was the tipping point for the entire Vietnam War. Johnson ordered American forces to openly attack the North, and he asked Congress to pass a resolution pre-approving any military actions the president would take. So we mentioned this in the 3.01 lesson in the Class Connect, that the Constitution gives Congress and only Congress the authority or the power to declare war. Once war is declared, then the president, as commander-in-chief, then has the power to wage that war, right? So what that means is that under our system of government, the president cannot legally wage war against another nation unless Congress has declared war against the nation. So later that night, on August 4th, McNamara and Johnson discuss the statement the president will make that night regarding a U.S. response to the second torpedo attack. So Johnson, on August 4th, 1964, in that midnight address, announcing that the United States will retaliate against North Vietnam for 2 attacks on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Later, Johnson and others would learn that the second attack, which ultimately was what propelled the president and Congress to enter the Vietnam War, never happened. So this was a conspiracy theory for many years, and was finally proven to be true. Ultimately, not that long ago. Within the last, I think, 18 years or so, it was actually proven to officially be true that second attack never happened. So Congress on August 7th of 1964 passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which grants Lyndon Johnson full authority to protect the peace in Southeast Asia. This was just as good to President Johnson as a declaration of war. This gave him all the authority he needed to wage war. He would later call the resolution and say that it was like Grandma's nightshirt, in that it covered everything. So, cue Golden Girls reference here. So, in 2003, a documentary came out called The Fog of War, in which a 91-year-old Robert McNamara, so this is that same Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara here, that we saw in those pictures. At the age of 91, Robert McNamara admits that the second attack that he and Johnson discussed, and that later led to congressional approval for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, never happened. Direct quote, "It didn't happen." So here's a quote from McNamara from that documentary. "It was just confusion, and events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen. And the judgment that we'd been attacked on August 2nd was right. We had been, although that was disputed at the time. So we were right once and wrong once. Ultimately, President Johnson authorized bombing in response to what he thought had been the second attack. It hadn't occurred, but that's irrelevant to the point I'm making here. He authorized the attack on the assumption it had occurred, and his belief that it was a conscious decision on the part of the North Vietnamese political and military leaders to escalate the conflict, and an indication they would not stop short of winning. We were wrong, but we had in our minds a mindset that led that to action, and it carried such heavy costs. We see incorrectly, or we see only half of the story at times." The interviewer then goes on to say, "We see what we want to believe," to which McNamara replies, "You're absolutely right. Belief and seeing, they're both often wrong. So break that down a little bit, right? McNamara is saying that second attack never happened, but he's almost trying to downplay that and say that doesn't matter. What matters is that they thought that it happened, and since they thought that it happened, that justifies them making that decision to send more troops. But ultimately, really what he's saying as well, if you kind of read between the, I guess you don't even really have to read between the lines, is he pretty much flat out says it, that that's what they wanted to believe happened. They didn't necessarily need to dig further or to fact check more or to find out that it truly didn't happen, because they wanted that second attack to have happened. They wanted to send more troops. They wanted to escalate that war. So having that purpose, even though it didn't actually happen, allowed them to do what they had already wanted to do. So what you need to think about, not only as a student in this class, but as a citizen of this country, are you okay with that? Is it okay to escalate what ultimately became a war based on faulty evidence, or based on the thought that something might happen, almost like a preemptive war? And that's going to be something that comes up again when we talk about the second Iraq War, which was a preemptive war by the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's kind of what you feel and what you believe. But think about that. Is that something that, as a citizen of the United States, that you're okay with? Was this cause of trying to stop communism from spreading worthy of what we ultimately engaged in Vietnam? Again, no right or wrong answer. I'm not trying to lean you one way or the other, but it's something to consider, something to think about. So yeah, that's the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Thanks for watching this video, and we will talk more about this in the next couple of lessons as well.